to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the market economy from 1820 to 1860 or so, and continuing our discussion of urbanization and immigration in this period. We're going to focus in this lecture on another of the prominent immigrant groups during that era, the Germans. In the previous lecture, we focused on the largest immigrant group coming during these years, the Irish. But the Germans were not too far behind. They were another very prominent group migrating in this era. About 1.4 million Germans emigrated between 1840 and 1860. So let's talk a little bit about contrast with the Irish and what you already know about the Irish. From 1830 to 1880, the Germans were always at least 25% of American immigrants. And by 1900, they made up about 26% of immigrants, while the Irish were 15% or so. In other words, the Irish really are the larger group in the years that we are focusing on, although Germans are very prominent, and then later the Germans become even more prominent. So the Irish were almost exclusively Catholic, while Germans were divided into three religious groups, or at least three: Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. While the Irish were almost exclusively urban and focused really in the eastern cities, Germans are both urban and rural or agricultural, and they often migrate much further into the kind of hinterlands inland within the United States. And Germans were much more likely to migrate as families as opposed to just single males, which we mentioned with the Irish. And unlike the Irish, who were fleeing starvation and essentially natural disaster, Germans more often were displaced by a growing and modernizing economy. This is not unlike what we talked about previously going on in the United States. As the economy became more modernized and mechanized, growing numbers of people found their jobs just displaced by machinery and the efficiencies of a more modern economy. And so many of them just sought opportunity and work by migrating to the United States. They generally didn't flee because they hated the situation in their homeland or hated their government. They actually continued to love their homeland and government, while the Irish despised the English who were controlling things in Ireland. While some Germans settled elsewhere, like Argentina or Russia, most Germans, about 90%, migrated to America. And their settlement patterns are in stark contrast to the Irish as well. While the Irish concentrated on the cities of the eastern seaboard like New York and Boston, Germans lived not only in those cities, but also many of them moved inland and settled more in Midwestern cities like Milwaukee, St. Louis, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, and so on. And in many cases, they replicated these kind of German towns or German enclaves where they continued to speak German and maintain many of their old traditions. As I mentioned, the Irish tended to work in unskilled manual labor kind of positions, while Germans typically worked in skilled trades. Perhaps you've heard the children's rhyme of the butcher, the baker, the cabinet maker, or the candlestick maker. These are all kinds of trades that Germans would work in, bakers and tailors and furniture makers and so on. Another of the common conceptions of German immigrants was the saloon. And a number of towns, we see dozens and dozens or even more saloons springing up within German communities. As one historian wrote, "Wherever three Germans congregated in the United States, one opened a saloon so the other two might have a place to argue." And so there are many saloons springing up in German areas. Cincinnati, for instance, had about 2,000 saloons by 1860. This picture just gives you a sense of the prominence of beer makers among German immigrants, and you might be familiar with some of the names, whether you know it or not. Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, and so on, all come from these German lines, and they rise to great prominence in certain cities in the country, like St. Louis and elsewhere, become hubs for these German beer makers. Some German immigrants as well found their way to the countryside and found work on farms there as well. Some had been farmers back in the homeland and thus replicated that in the United States. And there again are some enclaves little touched by outside influences where Germans can maintain essentially the same life that they had back in the homeland. So Germans become a very influential part of American life, and their influence is felt from the most southernmost reaches all the way through the north, in the cities, and in the countryside as well. So between Irish and Germans and many other immigrant groups, there is both good and bad from this influx of immigrants. Our nation is blessed with diversity, and they bring new cultures and customs to America. But the presence of so many foreigners makes many natives uncomfortable. And we'll see many cases of native-born Americans mistreating new arrivals of immigrants, and even in some cases established immigrants turning around and mistreating those who are new to arrive. In future lectures, we will talk about the rise of nativism, anti-immigrant feelings. In the 1840s, there were a number of riots between Protestants and Catholics, primarily Irish immigrants. And in the 1850s, a political party called the Know Nothing Party was founded largely on a nativist or anti-immigrant platform. We'll get to those developments in a future lecture. There are a few other elements of urbanization that I want to cover before we turn to other parts of the market economy in this era. One of them is the creation of free black communities. Growing numbers of free blacks were growing primarily in the North and Midwest, although there were some in the South as well. While they had their freedom, blacks still confronted long odds, and they faced considerable racial prejudice and discrimination in every part of the country. I mentioned some of these already. As one example, in 1849, the abolitionist Charles Sumner, who goes on to become a very prominent senator, and we're going to talk about Sumner a great deal later in the course, sued the city of Boston to allow blacks to attend all-white schools because all black schools were inferior. These are arguments a century ahead of their time when we think about the Brown versus Board of Education cases. And the Massachusetts Supreme Court, perhaps not surprisingly, struck those arguments down at that time. But it just tells you that even at that time, there were people who were aware that segregated schools created issues. Blacks also confronted challenges in terms of equality in housing and fairness in the workplace. Occasionally, they were able to find successful work, and in a handful of cases, even compile considerable amounts of wealth. But those cases are rare and accomplished in the face of very long odds. As a final note, I mentioned in the previous lecture some of the kind of seedier sides of urban life in this time. And some of this was due to riots and violence that resulted from the growing racial and ethnic diversity in many of the cities. There were race riots in Cincinnati in 1829, 1836, and 1841, and again in New York in 1834. And there were many such instances around the country as different groups struggled to establish their own dominance. There was also a considerable amount of violence in the cities that arose from what we might today call gang violence, but also sprung from the fact that so many immigrants were single men, and thus they engaged in a kind of rough and tumble bachelor lifestyle that often involved alcohol, consorting with prostitutes, and fighting to prove their manliness. As a final note, I mentioned prostitution. There were growing numbers of young single women who migrated into the cities seeking opportunities, and thus many of them found themselves entangled in prostitution. It is suggested that midway through the century, in 1850 or so, prostitution was the second biggest industry in New York City. So while, as I mentioned, the cities offered excitement and opportunity, jobs, and in some cases wealth and prosperity, there were many other challenges as well to be overcome for the growing masses of people who lived in America.